Medical school did not prepare me for one of my first patients' chief complaint. My soul hurt, she said. Joni, as I'll call her, had been in agony for a decade since her ex, Tony, pushed her down the stairs during an argument, leaving her with pain in her back, her neck, and her head. Then she got hooked on the pain pills other doctors prescribed for her. So when Joni told me she needed a prescription for OxyContin until she could see a specialist in the pain clinic, I felt my contempt rise. Probably another junkie, I thought. Back then, I was a newly minted physician and also a latent poet. Still, I didn't yet fully understand how we are equally our physical bodies and our words. How could I? Medical training focuses on anatomy and physiology and diagnostic skills. Nowadays, it also showcases cutting-edge technologies like robotic surgery, genetically customized cancer treatments, and 3D printing of human organs. What medical school also ends up teaching is detachment, to protect ourselves from the anguish no one wishes to see, even doctors. So I didn't know what to prescribe for my soul hurts. I asked Joni to tell me more. She paused, then said no one had ever asked her about her deeper pain. She wasn't sure she had the words to describe it. I didn't give her a prescription for the painkillers, so I was surprised when she showed up for our next appointment. She brought a battered guitar and asked if she could play a love song she had composed for Tony. There she was, sobbing and singing her heart out for the man who beat her for years. As I felt my heart open, I witnessed that when pain takes our breath away, poetry resuscitates us. Poetry seemed to heal. Her song proved that poetry could break down barriers between beleaguered doctors and stigmatized patients. Poetry sparks empathy, and empathy is essential for our survival. If we weren't moved by their pain, would we reach out to the afflicted? Would we be inspired to perform heroic acts? Without empathy, how would we heal? Think about how you react when your favorite song comes on the radio. Do you sing along without realizing it? Does the hair on the back of your neck stand up as you tap your foot to the beat? Do you feel more miraculously alive? This is the power of poetry. All the while, mirror neurons in your brain fire as you connect with the lyrics, which are poetry. Scientific studies show that breathing and heart rate synchronize, much like in meditation, when we hear rhythmic language and recite poetry. Our bodies translate crude sensory data into nuanced knowing. Poetry is enlightenment through ecstatic experience. Feeling becomes meaning. Poetry can heal, or, as the great 13th century poet Rumi put it, the wound is the place where the light enters you. I pass you in a hurry on my way to where another woman who I know is dying of a stroke that in the end is nothing worse than what is killing you. Same gurney, same bruised arms and mute IV. You wait for what might be a final test. It's something in the way you look at me that makes me realize you have your own mistakes you think you're paying for, your own ungrateful kids, your own unspeakable pain. Yet you look at me, still desperate for just another human being to look kindly back at you, to see in you the end is not far off, is not so unimaginable. During the height of the AIDS crisis, I treated a patient named Michael who'd moved to San Francisco from Oklahoma after his family disowned him because he was gay. When I told him his HIV test was positive, he looked down at his scuffed cowboy boots. I was exhausted. I'd been up all night on call in the hospital, admitting 5 other men like him. With no effective treatment for AIDS, I knew they were all going to die. All I could do was correct a low potassium or drain an infected lung, delaying for a little while the inevitable. When he finally looked back up at me, he said with a faint drawl, "Do y'all know that there's a cactus that blooms with the most beautiful flower in the middle of the desert back where I'm from?" But I cut him off, thinking about checking his T-cell count or whether he had health insurance that would pay for AZT. I didn't have time to muse about flowers in the desert. When he returned a few weeks later, he was wearing this black T-shirt emblazoned with a hot pink triangle and the words, "Silence equals death." He'd brought me a gift, a tiny cactus in a pot. "Even if you don't water it," he said, "it'll probably outlive me." One weekend, some friends dragged me to my first gay pride parade. Shouts in the street pulled me into the fray. Then I spotted Michael marching with the AIDS advocacy group ACT UP, shirtless, his body pulsing, calling out, "Silence equals death. Silence equals death. Silence equals death." Months later, he died of a severe fungal infection, once common in people with AIDS who grew up in the desert Southwest. But thanks to voices like Michael's refusing to be silenced, I haven't diagnosed it in years. This outspoken activism galvanized disparate communities to come together and spurred new scientific discoveries, including the HIV treatments I now prescribe that have saved countless lives. Our voices endure. Open mic poetry readings become calls to action. Slogans shouted in the street compel our attention. Our poetry heals, and perhaps it even keeps us alive. Years ago, I watched a patient of mine say goodbye to life. He was alone like you, alone like me. He was in agony. He looked at me, and I, afraid to be the last thing here on earth he saw, twisted my head to look away. I almost do the same to you, afraid you might imagine me as later you lay dying, but I don't. At his annual physical, Manuel said he was turning yellow. My daughter says I'm the color of the sun. A CT scan confirmed my suspicion, pancreatic cancer, which had already spread to his liver. He was only 46 years old. It was too advanced for surgery, and he declined palliative chemotherapy. When it became clear he was dying, he requested comfort measures only. Through a thicket of IV poles, he shared stories about his life, which his wife wrote down in a poetic record she called Blessings, immortalizing him line by line as he hung on those last extra days to author his own epilogue. Poetry heals, and sometimes it even keeps us alive. In modern medicine, we focus on curing, but neglect healing. When there isn't another procedure to perform or cycle of chemo to infuse, too often we abandon the sick, leaving them to the social worker or hospice volunteer, or alone. As our medical knowledge expands, doctors' checklists grow longer, and our time with each patient shrinks. This distancing causes stress, soon followed by burnout. No wonder our patients feel unheard. We've all been robbed of our empathy and compassion. But poetry restores us to an awareness of the beating of our hearts and the ebb and flow of our breathing, locating us in our human bodies. We're no longer shielded by our white coats, nor drowned out by the endless bleeping and buzzing of our machines. For all you scientists out there who crave randomized controlled trials, I get it. I'm a scientist too. Know that, in fact, there's emerging research that bears out how teaching poetry to medical students helps them listen better, preserves empathy, and improves patients' perceptions of the quality of their care. And cancer patients who read poetry together report decreased pain and can overcome depression. By the way, despite staunch claims to objective science, medicine can still make mistakes. Disease risk factors can become stereotypes. Causality can morph into culpability. Doctors can pass judgment and assign blame, which undermines care. Dehumanizing judgments like substance abuse results from lack of self-love, or AIDS is a punishment from God, or cancer is caused by suppressed anger. Perhaps it will take humane poetry by making doctors more empathic to finally dispel such lurking biases. I was taught and once believed that the hard facts of science and the unfeeling gleam of technology were all we needed to solve the problem of human suffering, and that poetry was merely a curious diversion. Of course, we must always strive to advance scientific knowledge, because poetry will never take the place of penicillin. Yet let us admit that science doesn't have all the answers, and see that the most innovative science is born of the same unorthodox thinking that inspires poetic expression. I'm a physician and a poet, together with like-minded colleagues who have forged a new discipline called the medical humanities. I've brought poetry to medicine. Or perhaps I've just recognized what has always been present in the art of healing. Inevitably, each of us becomes a patient. When it is your turn, our turn, know that our voices matter. We needn't fear what we can't explain, but instead meet illness with empathy and let the light enter us. Because in the end, it's our poetry that heals. It's our poetry that keeps us alive. Instead, I look at you remorselessly, the way I hope that someday I am seen, the way each one deserves to be imagined, if not restored to health, then brought to life.